words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. And immediately something like scales fell from his eyes, and his sight was restored. This is the line that jumped out at me from the first reading that we heard this morning. It describes a moment so iconic that it still echoes through history. The moment in time when this guy named Saul, who was a zealous persecutor and murderer of Christians, becomes Paul, the apostle of grace. It's the kind of turn that you don't see coming. One minute, Saul thinks he knows everything, and the next he realizes he's so misguided that he actually knows nothing. He thought he saw clearly, but in reality he was so blind. And here, for the first time, his eyes are open and he sees the truth. I wonder if you've had a moment like that in your life. Maybe not as dramatic where you're on a road and a light blinds you, but a moment when you were so sure, so certain that you saw something clearly, only to realize that you were completely wrong. I definitely have moments like that in my life. Moments and seasons that resulted in what I could only describe as scales falling from my eyes. I'm so incredibly grateful for those moments. In fact, I wouldn't really recognize myself today apart from those moments. Because when your eyes open to a truth, especially when you're convinced of the opposite, it sends ripple effects through your life, like a stone dropped in still water, disturbing everything you thought was calm, until even the far edges of your soul begin to move. Have you had moments like that? I think our world is in desperate need of a moment like that right now. I saw something 2 weeks ago that I want to talk about today. It's one of those things that is so out of the box that your brain doesn't know where to register it. It just kind of bounces around. In some ways, it's still bouncing around in my head. It's one of those things that has the power to open your eyes. I was watching an interview about Pope Francis's life, and during the interview, they showed this video clip from 2019. You may remember this from the news when it happened 6 years ago. For some reason, I had never seen it until 2 weeks ago. And I would know because it's impossible to forget. Once you see it, you never forget it. In April 2019, Pope Francis and the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time, Justin Welby, held a spiritual retreat at the Vatican. To understand why this retreat was so significant, we need to know a bit of the background. South Sudan, the world's youngest country, gained independence from Sudan in 2011 after decades of civil war. Now, everything I'm about to share with you from here on out is separate from the conflict that we read about in Sudan that's covered by the media today, between military factions in northern Sudan, not South Sudan. It's a little confusing. I know it's two Sudans, two brutal conflicts, but they are distinct, and I'm talking about South Sudan. So unfortunately, peace in South Sudan didn't last. Everyone was so excited and hopeful when South Sudan gained its independence from Sudan in 2011. There was a sense of possibility, even joy, that after so many decades of conflict, a new nation can finally chart its own future. But within just 2 years, by 2013, that hope began to unravel. Political tensions between the president and his former vice president boiled over into violence. What began as a power struggle at the highest level of government between these two men who represented the two main ethnic groups in South Sudan quickly took on ethnic dimensions, and the conflict spread like wildfire across the country. It became civil war all over again. Just imagine that. You gain independence thinking that this is your now hope after having been stuck in a civil war, and within 2 years you're back in civil war in the newly established country. An estimated 400,000 people were killed. 400,000 people. Over 4 million were displaced from their homes. I know numbers like that are hard to register. By 2017, nearly half of South Sudan's population faced severe food insecurity, and famine was officially declared in parts of the country. So peace deals came and went, but the violence kept returning. And we're literally talking like within 7 years since the establishment of this new country. The conflict kept and the violence kept returning, fueled in large part by the ongoing rivalry between these two guys, the president and the former vice president, who was the opposition leader. They're both vying for power, and by early 2019, the stakes were so high because a new peace agreement had been signed the previous year, and the leaders were under international pressure to form a unity government by May. So it's April, and they're going, how in the world do we form a unity government when the distrust goes so deep? And the entire peace initiative was on the brink of collapse. And that's when Pope Francis stepped in. In the midst of this chaos, in April of 2019, the Pope invites the top South Sudanese leaders to the Vatican, especially these two guys, the president and the former vice president, the very two men whose rivalry had fueled so much of the conflict. Both men are Christians, by the way, which is consistent with the demographic of South Sudan. So when you think Sudan, you often think Muslim. That's what's happening in the northern part of Sudan today. South Sudan, the population is majority Christian, and the president is Catholic, and the opposition leader, the former vice president, is Presbyterian. And this retreat that the Pope invites them to wasn't for a negotiation or a summit, but rather it was a spiritual retreat, a chance to stop, reflect, and pray. And how could these two leaders ignore an invitation to the Vatican? So they show up. They agree to step away from power and into the common space of prayer and listening. And just when you thought that moment couldn't be more striking, the retreat concludes with a gesture no one could have possibly predicted. At the end of the final session, this was like a 3-day retreat, Pope Francis, then 82 years old, suffering from chronic pain and difficulty walking, he stands up. He slowly makes his way over to the leaders and he kneels before them. First before the president of South Sudan, then the opposition leader, the former vice president, then others. And one by one, on his knees, Pope Francis kisses their feet. And he says to them, not with authority, but with a trembling voice full of emotion, I ask you, as a brother, stay in peace. That's the clip that I saw. You can hear the room shift. You could feel the air tighten. This wasn't staged. It wasn't political theater. This was the most powerful religious figure on earth, with a larger following than any other leader in the whole world, on his knees, kissing the feet of men who had led their country into war, pleading with them to use their power for good. It was a moment so profoundly disorienting that you could almost hear the scales hitting the floor. The reason why I'm sharing this story is because I have a feeling that, like me, many of you are also desperate for a different vision of leadership in our world today. A leadership that doesn't cling to control, which is so rampant. I mean, that's all that we see. But a kind of leadership that lays it down for the sake of peace. I wonder what this world would be like if leadership looked a little more like that moment at the Vatican. What if it looked less like a podium and more like a basin of water and a towel? And I'm not just talking about national or global politics here. I'm talking about you and me. I'm talking about St. John's and about our very understanding of power and influence. I've heard the story of Jesus washing the disciples' feet 100 times, but I've never felt the true revolutionary power of it on a gut level as I did 2 weeks ago when I saw that clip for the first time. In that moment, the gospel wasn't just a story from the past. It was alive. It was embodied. It was disruptive. The Pope on his knees like that, that's when I really understood what Jesus was trying to show us. Foot washing isn't polite or symbolic, something that we do on Maundy Thursday to remember. Foot washing is political. It's spiritual. It's dangerous because it turns the whole system upside down. That's when I really understood that this kind of humility isn't weakness, it's the deepest kind of courage. Those South Sudanese leaders would have been completely unfazed if the Pope had sat in his papal seat and delivered a firm, well-worded appeal for peace from above. They would have been completely unfazed. That's what leaders do. They speak, they advise, they issue firm statements. That's what we're used to. But the Pope disrupted the entire system by showing them a different form of power. In that moment, he was discipling them. To be honest, I'm trying to still wrap my mind around it, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's 100 years before we ever see something like that again by a world leader, doing something so radical, so countercultural like that. But I'm coming to understand in a new way that it takes far more strength and discipline to serve with humility than to rule with power. It takes more strength to forgive than it does to retaliate. Retaliating is easy. Forgiveness is hard. It takes far more strength to wash feet than to throw punches. And in a world obsessed with dominance, that kind of leadership is nothing short of revolutionary. And that's the only kind of leadership Jesus calls the church to. I speak the truth to you today, St. John's. We have our annual parish meeting after this service. The annual parish meeting this Sunday is always a good time to take stock, to ask questions like, who are we as a church community? What's our essence? What are we about? What is our commitment to each other? How do we measure impact as a church? What's our lens? Do we measure it by church attendance numbers and budgets? Or do we measure it by lives transformed and hearts softened? Are we trying to grow bigger, or is it about going deeper? What's our focus? Are we chasing greatness as a church, or are we practicing the gospel? Because the gospel isn't just something we hear, it's something that we embody. We practice the gospel. We workshop it until it becomes something that is natural for us in this world. And if we let it reshape our vision, if we let the scales fall, there's no telling how far the ripple effects might reach. St. John's, let's continue to be that kind of church.